2, 1. Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Don Falgout.
And I am your other host, Stephen Falgout. Get Recc'd is our occasional podcast where every week Dawn recommends something to me, I recommend something to Dawn, and then we discuss it in the next episode.
And discuss is what we are going to do here today, as we always do, except for last time. There was no discussion in the last episode, so I'm glad you all were okay with that.
Yeah, it was weird actually. Most of our listeners might not remember this, but actually our last episode was a silent episode. We actually only had title cards. It was kind of like a silent movie, but it was a silent podcast.
Yeah, and it was especially great for Castbox listeners because they got just to enjoy a nice hour of calm silence. And I think it was a good idea. I think it was a nice special. I mean, y'all can leave your feedback on that. But for me, I thought it went swimmingly.
Yeah, and I want to be very clear. We are not going to read that feedback. Like, you can leave it, but we won't look at that at all. We don't read.
Yeah, we also don't take criticism very well. We get very, very angry if anybody criticizes our podcast. So, you know.
Yeah, and there are a lot of haters out there. Like, every day I'm getting messages from the haters that are like, why don't you get wrecked? And I'm like, didn't even read it, so I don't even know.
Yeah, and I shed a tear for all of the Get Recc'd haters out there. So
yeah,
I would just like to say, you know, every podcast, I am aware that probably around 90 to 100% of our viewers are hate watchers. We hear you. We don't care. Okay. I mean, I care
first
a
of
lot,
all,
but
first of all, it's a podcast, so don't even watch it. Listen to it, dumbos. Am I right?
True. Yeah, and
so take that, hater watchers.
And we do have an exciting podcast to listen to this week, which we will begin with what Steven recommended to me, if that's all right.
Yes, let's do it.
All right, go ahead and explain.
So last time, Dawn, I recommended to you Defunctland. Defunctland is a YouTube channel, also a YouTube series. Specifically, I recommended to you the series known as Defunctland. The channel has other kind of mini-series and somewhat long-running series at this point as well. But the Defunctland series was started by Kevin Perjurer, essentially chronicling, cataloging old and defunct theme park rides of various varieties and from various theme parks, with the intention to eventually bring it into its own theme park known as Defunctland. That obviously can't actually happen logistically for a number of reasons, but what can happen is a VR experience where you can kind of re-experience the rides in their potentially original or as close to original form as possible before they get shut down as well because of copyright. But as of right now, the reason why I sent this to you, or I recommended to you last time, was because the first of those VR ride-through experiences is finally available after all this time. I will say generally the actual YouTube series itself has morphed into something much different than it used to be, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But anyway, I will hand it over to you to talk about Defunctland.
Yeah, I've been a fan of Defunctland since around the time when they started. They had a couple episodes. I think at that time it was just Kevin Perjurer. I mean, I'm pretty sure when you go back and watch them, I can't imagine there was a team working on those videos. The beginnings were very humble, for sure. I think it was better watching those then than watching them now, after what Defunctland has become, because I think Defunctland actually is at least seems like a pretty well-researched and well-funded and, you know, decent budget production. I don't think there's a lot of money that goes into it, but my only point is that the editing's gotten much better, the presentation's gotten much better from the early episodes where he was like talking into a voice changer and putting up like a bunch of stock images and such. But it has gotten a lot farther than there. And I think something that I like a lot about Defunctland compared to any other channel out there that documents like, you know, abandoned history or like theme park history or whatever, is that Defunctland has this kind of weird charm to it. And I say weird charm because the whole thing feels like it has a sense of humor to it, but it's so dry about it because it seems like as he's reading these scripts that he doesn't even find them funny. So, like, there's this like really odd disconnect about some of the, especially the early episodes that I kind of like. It makes it a little bit more than just a dull history lesson, even though sometimes it's almost like presented that way. And as the show has gone on, the episodes definitely got a lot better. A lot of later Defunctland episodes up until now tend to present themselves with some kind of gimmick, even if it's just like a title card or whatever. It's something that gives it a little bit of extra flair, a little bit of extra personality. And also, the storytelling has definitely improved a lot as well, which is probably the main thing you're coming to the channel for. Like, in a given video, he will detail this defunct attraction. It's moved on from just theme park rides. It's gone on to be, aside from the other series, even in the main Defunctland series, it's gone on to talk about like entire theme parks, to talking about like outside of like theme park attractions, like the Toys R Us store and in Times Square and things like that. Just any major attraction that does not exist anymore. And the research and storytelling of these little history lessons makes it really digestible and really interesting and pretty fun as well. And again, I still feel like, and I acknowledge that this might not be an intentional aspect of the series, but I still feel like there's that weird, dry, like awkwardness to the show that I like. And again, I have no idea if that's the point, but I find it silly. And that, coupled with the bigger production value now, I think has made it into something a lot more watchable and good.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think over time the production has gotten a lot better. There's hype around each video release now, and these videos have gotten to be pretty long. Like, they used to be, you know, not necessarily bite-sized views of history of specific rides. Like, they always had some length to them, but now they feel like a production. In ways that are good, but I also think in ways that might be a detriment to the series, because I do feel like generally, and it's kind of getting back to its original vision, I do feel like this series has kind of lost its way at certain points in the life cycle, because as you mentioned, it's grown more than just like, hey, look at these old defunct rides, to now like, hey, look at whole theme parks. Look at history of like old New York City and Atlantic City and those sorts of things. And some of the episodes even got into this place where they were specifically history around the animation studio of Walt Disney and like worker strikes and unionizing and those sorts of things. And while, don't get me wrong, like all of that was very interesting, and there is a lot of production around that, I feel like it sometimes came to the detriment of the vision of what this series originally started as. Now, I say that, but like ultimately, does that impact the quality of the videos or of the channel at all? No, not really. I do 100% agree. As time has gone on, this series has only gotten better, and it's engaging and it is funny in a super dry way. There's a lot of jabs at very important corporate figures in all of these theme parks and those sorts of things. There's a lot of reverence paid to the original attraction, to nostalgia around those original attractions, to important historical events around those original attractions. Um, Ultimately, I feel like Kevin just does a really great job with this thing that he has created. And I haven't personally done the VR experience yet. I just wanted to point this out because this is kind of an aside to talking about the channel itself. But there is a video on the channel where you can actually just basically watch it as a video. And the group that is working on those is doing a ton of work around paying that same sort of reverence to what Kevin's like kind of original idea was. So all of that is just, really encouraging and super interesting and very entertaining to watch.
I do want to say that I also fell out. Well, I don't know if you said you fell out, but around the same time that you were discussing um, a lot of the changes to some of the topics that were being covered on the channel, like that was around the time when I fell out because a lot of that stuff just didn't interest me as much. Whenever I did catch a video, though, I was always really impressed by how far it had gone. It's just that the topics weren't quite as interesting because I really like stupid history about old theme park rides. I think it can be really fun and interesting, and there's a couple of channels that do it. A couple of channels that came up around the same time this one did too that I was watching, like Yesterworld, and that's the only one that's coming to mind. But I always did think that there was something to Defunctland. There was like some ambition to it. Not a lot, but it was always there. Even in the very beginning, just the idea of what the series was supposed to be, which was purely like building a theme park out of old rides. And that was something that would be mentioned in every video. And that kind of fell away, even though they're still working on that project. But that was like an ambition to it that made it feel a little bit more than other channels.
Yeah,
And
and I would add one thing too, where I think, and you've kind of touched on this, but where I think that it sort of differentiated itself, where was a lot of other videos that were looking at defunct attractions, they all had their different flavor, but for the most part, they all kind of felt like someone got a piece of paper, took down a lot of notes from Wikipedia or from various articles, and we're just kind of reading off that script, like giving you pretty much a very straight-faced representation of the history. Whereas Defunctland, while Kevin does do that research, crafts kind of a narrative around these things that makes it a little more interesting and digestible, I feel like, than just, although I also do watch a lot of those other channels, it does make it probably more entertaining for a broader audience than an audience that's like very niche, just wanting to know very specific facts about old rides.
yeah, I completely agree with that. A lot of other channels that do this kind of thing, they feel like listicles in video form, and you feel like, yeah, you could read Wikipedia and get the same value out of that. In fact, a lot of other channels do like list videos, like the top 10 defunct whatever, um, and and that can be digestible, but it's not really the best content out there, I wouldn't say. And Defunctland stays mostly away from that, for sure. It feels more like little stories in really well edited packages with a lot of another great thing Defunctland does that I didn't see any channels really doing before, but I see a lot doing after, and I say see because I'm not certain that Defunctland was the first, but Defunctland introduced like old advertisements into the mix. So during the explanation, it would stop and show like an old ad about the ride or about the park, and sometimes it would show the entire ad. And even though it could take up a chunk of the video, it helped a lot to provide like extra context and really put you into the time and like make it feel a little bit more personal, so that you could get some idea of what it would have been like to hold nostalgia for these rides or these parks or whatever, even if you never actually went or experienced them. And I've seen a lot
Marketing
of
materials.
channels. What?
I was just going to say marketing materials as well. A lot of times will be interjected, so not just ads, but sometimes other various marketing materials.
Yeah, and it's cool. I've seen a lot of other channels do this since as well. And again, I don't know if they were the first, but Defunctland really had that from episode one. There's stuff like that in it. And I think that's another thing that just helps. I think probably the main thing to me that separates Defunctland from the other channels is that Defunctland allows you to feel like you're a part of the nostalgia of what it's talking about, even if you're not, in a way that I haven't seen any other channels really do. And I do like that about it.
Yeah, and I definitely don't think they were the first to do this either, but also interjecting a lot of like old video footage of not necessarily the ride, but old video footage of like ride opening and big events around the ride, those sorts of things as well as sometimes even interjecting like old video footage of ride throughs and those sorts of experiences, which a lot of other channels do that as well, but Kevin does a good job of like putting that all together into one very consistent narrative for a video versus just like, as you mentioned, kind of a listicle or just like showing these things in interspersed parts that don't really make up a whole.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like I've said everything there is to say. We didn't, and if Steven has anything else, that's fine. But I do want to say we didn't say anything about Defunctland TV, and I think they have like one other show. I mean, it's not really all that relevant. I have seen an episode of Defunctland TV when it started, and it just wasn't interesting to me. But I will say that was, I think, the moment when I saw the production value of this show like skyrocket, or I should say of this channel. I can't remember what the first Defunctland TV episode was, but I remember just thinking it felt like a team worked on it, which was really cool. And after that point, the Defunctland series itself also started to kind of carry that as well. So I think there are more. I mean, I know there are more people working on it now, and they have a series that somebody else even hosts, I think. So so it has gotten bigger and it has grown, which is cool. I don't know if you have anything else to say or if we should wrap it up.
Yeah, Defunct TV. I know you just said that you don't watch it that much, but I like that one a lot too. It brings that same feeling that you described. It's like it throws you into that nostalgia, even if you don't have nostalgia for that specific thing. It does a really good job of, analyzing not only the show itself and going through all the intricacies of the show, but also all that surrounding material as well, which I think, blends into exactly what we were just talking about with Defunctland. Talking about like major executives and how the show got off the ground and those sorts of things, almost in a documentary style. And I think that's probably the biggest thing I would say about Defunctland is it feels more like a documentary than it does like hey, look at this list of facts about a ride from the past. The other thing I'll mention is I know, like, for instance, as you mentioned, the channel was getting bigger and they were adding more things. I think a lot of that actually fell by the wayside. Like, I know at one point he had a podcast, which I caught a couple episodes of and those sorts of things. But for the most part, I mean, the channel really is the Defunctland show. So if you don't like that, you probably won't like the other content, honestly. But I think that the content is so easily consumable and oftentimes pretty funny and just, very good.
Okay, so we should wrap it up then.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I've always liked Defunctland. I have fallen out with it lately, but I'm kind of getting back into it just from having watched it for this podcast. It was definitely one of my favorite channels to watch for a good while because there were a string of like theme park history channels that were coming up around the same time. Not that this was like a new thing entirely, although I don't remember really ever seeing channels that were developed just for this concept, but there were a couple in tandem with Defunctland, and I liked a lot of them, but I definitely thought Defunctland was the best one, and I still do. And in fact, it's outshined the other ones in a lot of ways since then. But yeah, we come to the problem of having to score a YouTube channel, but I don't know. In terms of the enjoyment I get from this series, I would give it like an 8. And because it's a lot of fun. It's awkward as hell in a way that, again, I'm not sure if it's meant to be or not, but I like that. And I like the storytelling, and I like the nostalgic presentation. It's not overkill, but it just gives you a nice personal understanding of things that are memories for other people, which can be pretty cool. And even some of the lesser known topics that they cover, Defunctland just makes really interesting. So I would definitely recommend the channel, especially if you like theme parks or theme park history at all. Like, why are you not watching Defunctland, And yeah, that's all I got to say.
Yeah, and I'm probably pretty much exactly the same. I'd probably put it at an 8. It's a very enjoyable series to watch, as I mentioned, and I know that you said that you actually fell off for a little bit of time, but there was like a very short period of time where I feel like the series kind of lost its way. And while those episodes were still interesting and there was a lot of work put behind them, I don't feel like they had the same charm or the same flavor as the rest of the series. But for the most part, every time a Defunctland video comes out, I am excited to watch it. And I definitely recommend the channel.
Great. So should we move on to what I recommended to you last time?
Yes, let's do it.
All right. Last episode, I recommended to Steven the 1985 film Pee-wee's Big Adventure. This was the Pee Wee Herman character's major foray into film and television, which he would go on to do after this. This was also Tim Burton's first feature-length film. Yeah, I'll let you go from there.
Pee-wee's Big Adventure, to me, has a ton of nostalgia around it. I used to watch this when I was much younger. I know that actually I don't know if I would say lately, but I've been hearing buzz around Pee-wee's Big Adventure every now and then because it keeps coming up as like people talking about Large Marge and how terrifying that was as a child. For whatever reason, Tim Burton had a way of doing that, I guess. This being a Tim Burton film and a Tim Burton film with Elfman, which we mentioned last time, but I'll mention again here. We just recently talked about that duo combining together to work on Batman Returns. Both of them do a really great job here with this film as well. I think Pee-wee as a character really lends itself to Tim Burton's kind of odd wackiness. And what's interesting is I feel like of all the properties that Tim Burton has worked on in his foray into live action, besides maybe Alice in Wonderland, this is such a wacky, like just off the wall character, and yet Tim Burton feels so tame here. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of oddity in this movie, but it is not the kind of crazy weirdness that we've come to expect with Tim Burton that we talked about at length at this point, which I do not like. I feel like he has gone so far off the deep end that it's almost unwatchable. This is very much watchable, but there is those flavors of, early Burton weirdness that I can really respect here. One thing I wanted to talk about before we kind of dive in is what is the most interesting or the weirdest thing to me that really stood out is it's like, okay, if I put myself in the time frame of 1985 when this movie comes out, if I am a fan of Pee-wee's Playhouse, there really is nothing from Pee-wee's Playhouse that transfers itself into the movie.
Well, Pee-wee's Playhouse came after this, right? Yeah. Yeah, Pee-wee's
Did
Playhouse.
it?
Yes, yeah, this was Pee-wee's first film, television, anything. Yeah, Pee-wee's Playhouse was a year after. Pee-wee started off as a stage character. He was like a right?
Oh, I don't know. I guess I don't know the history. I didn't know any of this because I was going to talk to you about it because it's like...
Yeah. Yeah, it was a stage performance. Yeah.
Well, I will say, first of all, Paul Rubens just is so good as this wacky character. I like the way that this movie just sort of generally progresses. I think it has a very easy hook for kids specifically to understand. Pee-wee has a bike, he loses his bike, and he goes on a big adventure to get his bike back. And just every component of that adventure is just fun. Like, he's just doing really weird stuff. He's getting himself into a whole bunch of different mishaps to find this bike. And ultimately, it just resolves itself in a way that's also very just fun way to wrap this movie up. Some of the things I will mention, though, is like now, watching it now, like taking those nostalgia glasses off, it's like the character is so annoying. Like, just sometimes really, honestly, unwatchable. And not only Pee-wee, but also Francis. Like, when those two interact on the screen, I was like, oh my God, I can't stand it. But other than that, it's just a really fun adventure movie. At times it's like this weird buddy cop movie. At times it's like something else. And I think Tim Burton does a great job of driving all of that.
Yeah, so this is like one of my favorite movies ever. Like this is like a top 5 movie for me. As far as like a comedy goes, like a pure comedy, this is my favorite ever. Um, I think this movie is hilarious. I think this movie is like the most charming thing in the world because when I watch this movie, something that I really gather from it directorially is that this movie feels super DIY for what it is. And I guess it makes sense that, you know, the Pee-wee character is just transitioning from like a stage character, like, oh, you know, he's a man child. That's the whole joke. Like, he's a child, but he's like a fully grown dude, and he's absolutely ridiculous. And that's all. I don't know what the stage show was like, but I can't imagine there was much more than that to work with. So the fact that they took it, some of the places that they took it, is just amazing to me. Like, I really like I really like the movie conceptually. I think it's really, really funny that they treat like his bike getting stolen as like the most universally horrible thing that could possibly happen to anyone. And he treats this other character, Francis, who is basically the exact same kind of person as Pee-wee. He's like a schoolyard bully, but he's like super rich and he lives in like this mansion. And it's just so many like stupid and absurd and ridiculous elements to the plot here, which suits the character perfectly. Because, and I will grant that, and it's not something I'm going to argue with, the idea that Pee-wee is like really annoying and unwatchable, because a lot of people, I think, will feel that way, and that's fine. Like, it makes sense. Like, he is designed almost to be annoying. But I think that this film uses that in such a phenomenal way. Like, and you said this, and it's true, that Tim Burton was really perfect for this character because Tim Burton's quirkiness and oddity is allowed to feel completely at home with a character as just wacky and ridiculous as Pee-wee. So you can have scenes where, like, you know, Pee-wee's having this crazy nightmare dream about, like, devilish clowns destroying his bike. And it's just like, yeah, I mean, he would, wouldn't he? Because he's got, like, a kid mind, you know? And it also works all the better because a lot of the comedy in this movie just kind of comes around putting Pee-wee in places with a bunch of other adults who he clearly does not belong with and should not be interacting with. And yet somehow, every single time, he wins over everybody in the stupidest ways. And it is just fantastic. That, or he gets into crazy feuds with people over incredibly stupid reasons. Like, you know, one woman's boyfriend, I guess, overhears them talking about a butt. It's in like a T-Rex's mouth. It's the stupidest shit. But I love the script for this movie. I love the pace of this movie. I think that every single scene in this movie is memorable, and there are so many great jokes that I think you can miss if you kind of just watch it as like a kid's adventure movie, which it like is and also isn't. For one thing, I my favorite joke in this film is when they go to a rodeo and well, they travel to Texas to go to the basement of the Alamo, which is already hilarious, and they end up in a rodeo where Pee-wee gets knocked out and he ends up on the side of a trailer, and there are all these like Texans, they all like run around, these Texas cowboys run around him, and they're like, oh, are you okay? He's like, yeah, like, do you remember anything? And he's like, I remember the Alamo. And then like all the Texans like jump up and throw their hats. It's just, there's just so many good scenes. I mean, there's more, but
yeah, or when he tries to prove that he's in Texas and he starts deep in the heart of Texas and everyone sings along.
Everyone bursts into song, yeah.
Which is very true. Yeah, I think, you know, adding to that, it's like there are so many iconic moments in this film too, like the that whole exchange that you mentioned with the T-Rex gas station. Like that's become honestly kind of a landmark now. You can still find that. Um, Also, the tequila scene I feel like is a very iconic scene coming from this movie.
Yes,
There's
which is amazing.
there's just so many really great scenes. Like it just feels it's nonstop too. It's like from second one, there's just so many great scenes. Like even thinking about his Rube Goldberg machine that he has in his house, which makes his breakfast, uh, and like the way that that is just filmed is so great.
And the score as well. The score adds a lot to that scene and a lot of scenes as well. Like Danny Elfman's score here is so good.
The other one thing I did want to mention, like from a criticism standpoint. Um, so watching it now, I find Pee Wee and Francis to be quite annoying, but still very watchable, still very funny. But I did not like, and I had completely forgot about this honestly, the way that they treat, um, can't even think of her name, but who's supposed to be her love interest, or anyway, who is kind of like falling over Pee Wee.
E.G.
The
Daily,
way,
right? Isn't it E.G.
Hmm?
Daily? It's the Powerpuff Girls voice actress, isn't it? Or are we talking about the other person? There's like two people who are like fawning over Pee Wee.
Not the one who ends up going to France.
Yeah,
Uh,
E.G. Daily.
yeah, I can't think of her character's name, but like the interaction that Pee Wee has with that character is just honestly, it, well, first of all, I feel like it's out of character and not out of character for Pee Wee Herman because he is a man child, but he has like a youthful innocence about him. But the way that he's just downright, honestly mean to this character for no discernible reason, really, it really struck me the wrong way. It's like it feels out of script.
Yeah, I can see that point. I don't know. I think a lot of the lines between these two are really funny. They end up playing Pee Wee up as like and it's so random when they'll do it too. It kind of is completely out of character.
Well, I do want to say the one thing that I did find hilarious, and it says so on the poster, is when he gives kind of like basically a James Dean speech to her about how
Yeah.
he's like a rebel and you can't hold him down, and then later that same line comes up when the murderer that he's helping, or should I say the person who cut off a mattress tag, uh, drives away and gives him that same line, and he goes, "Wow, deja vu."
Yeah, well, that's what I was gonna say though. That I think that like that's a lot of the interaction between him and this woman who's like fawning over him, and he's like trying not to get involved because he thinks he's like some like crazy loner adventurer, but it's the only times in the entire movie that he does it, and he'll like leave these scenes and like chuckle to himself like it was some weird joke. It is kind of mean spirited, but it's also like really weird and funny, much like a lot of this movie is to me. Um, Obviously, you did mention the Large Marge scene, which is one of the best scenes in the movie for sure, and it's one of the most Burton-y scenes in the movie. And it's true, people do bring it up as like, a disturbing moment from their childhood, and like, yeah, honestly, this movie I guess is like a family film, but the comedy element here is just not a kids kind of thing. Like no kid's gonna think it's funny that it like or they're not going to get the joke entirely anyway. They might find Pee-wee funny because he's kind of goofy, but I don't think they're going to really understand the point of the joke, which is that like, he's like a child in a man's body or whatever. But the Large Marge scene is definitely one that like children are not going to understand the joke of it. They're just going to be scared by the scary face. And it is kind of spooky, but like this scene is also just so fucking funny because the movie just comes to like a dead stop when he gets in this truck and the music just turns into like horror music, and all of a sudden the entire tone of the film shifts and Pee-wee is just like sitting there like almost like a stand-in for the audience, just like what the fuck is going on, and then it happens and then it's just like over with. I mean, he goes into a bar and they make a joke about that too, but it's so bizarre. And it's like such a weird moment that's just thrown in here. But honestly, that's how a lot of the scenes progress, so it doesn't even feel out of place. It's just like a weird throwaway, and then it's like over, and I love that.
Yeah, and just the idea of the chase scene on the Warner Brothers lot because he finds out that his bike was given to the Warner Brothers lot. And the other thing that I wanted to mention as well, like watching it now that I'm older and I've seen a lot more films, there's a lot of like film genre tropes here and cliches, which are, definitely played for satire, which is really funny. Like the one that comes to mind is like essentially Francis makes himself up like a mob boss because he hired a hit on Pee Wee's bike and then he doesn't want to be in the game anymore, so he sends the guy away with the bike. Like that scene was just so funny to me, like from a standpoint of it trying to like frame itself as like sort of a gangster mob moment.
Oh yeah, and then of course with the entire ending of the film being, like they film Pee Wee's story for the movies, and then they go to see the movie, and that entire film is just like a send up of like poorly dubbed like kung fu movies, but also like spy movies, and also like all this weird stuff, which is funny because I mean, even though that part is a lot more obvious about it, the whole movie plays out that way. Like it's a road trip film that just goes and spoofs a whole bunch of shit like for kind of no reason. It's so willy-nilly about everything, which is, I think, the thing I like the most about it. That it's such a carefree, enjoyable movie that just does whatever the hell it wants. And, like, there's a story. Pee-wee's going to find his bike. He's, he has to go all around the country. Like, there's a story, but it's just an excuse to do a bunch of goofy shit and a bunch of weird shit. Just whatever the hell they want. And I think Pee-wee, Paul Rubens' performance as Pee-wee here is just so funny alongside all of that. To me, it is glorious.
Yeah, and it really does stand the test of time too. Like watching it now, it still holds up just as well as it did. And there are effects that have obviously aged, but a lot of those effects are, using kind of stop motion clay, which Tim Burton ends up becoming very proficient at. So even those, although watching it now, you can, Large Marge probably doesn't have the same effect on someone watching it now than it did someone watching it in '85, but a lot of that stuff still looks good and honestly has aged in a way which makes it even funnier. Like it fits even more in the absurdity of this film that Large Marge is this like weird clay monster.
Yeah, it's charming. It's very
yeah,
it's got that
and
low budget charm.
And that is definitely the exact word I would use for this movie. The whole thing is just very charming. It's easily watchable. It has a lot of funny moments, but there's just such a happy nostalgia and charm around it. It's lighthearted. It never takes itself too seriously, and although I do feel like, as I mentioned, the interaction with, again, I can't remember the character's name.
Dottie. That's right. I got
Dottie.
it.
Yeah. Dottie. Although that interaction can be kind of mean-spirited, for the most part, like all of it is very lighthearted and just fun. And I absolutely appreciate that. Now I will ask, knowing the history, going out the end of this, how do you think this transitions then into Pee-wee's Playhouse?
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea. I used to watch Pee-wee's Playhouse when I was a kid, and those are the only memories I have of it. And it feels like a fever dream in retrospect. I don't know. Like, I would have to watch it. I guess Pee-wee's Playhouse was something that was actually a lot more designed for children than this movie was. Though even Pee-wee's Playhouse like wound up getting an adult viewing because I think it's just so bizarre and ridiculous. And I know like Adult Swim ended up airing it eventually. So I'm sure that Tim Burton's sensibility that he injected into the character with this movie probably inspired what Pee-wee's Playhouse ended up being, I would assume. Because, again, there's so many like elements that I remember disparately in my head that feel so strange. And maybe it's good, too. I don't know. But
a lot more puppets, that's for sure.
Yeah, and a lot of claymation, if I remember. Like a lot of stuff like that, yeah.
Maybe we'll have to check that out sometime, and we can compare. But that aside, this movie is just a ton of fun. And Danny Elfman does a great job too. We already mentioned that. I think that it's, this was kind of Burton's directorial debut, at least for live action, right?
Yeah, for a full feature length, this was the first one.
Which is definitely interesting. And I'm sure that, from the studio standpoint, they probably reined Burton in a lot more than they rein Burton in now. And probably that's why it's not as wacky, zany, like completely off the wall as Burton has kind of become. But even those bits of Burton that do shine here, they shine really well. And as we already kind of talked about, he leads the character into a really great direction. So with that, I'm kind of done talking about it. Should we wrap it up?
Yeah, definitely go ahead.
Yeah, well, those are pretty much my thoughts. I mean, I have a ton of nostalgia for this film, but I would say even looking past that nostalgia, it's just a really fun film to watch. It has a lot of funny moments, and as I've gotten older, I've been able to pick up on a lot more jokes and satire that I think have made it even more charming and more fun. Um, the premise is super clean, and while I don't know if this was necessarily the first movie of this kind, I would highly doubt it. It definitely spawned a lot of movies that have like a similar premise of just sort of like this big adventure film with a singular purpose. And the way that it's done here is really great. So with that, I'd probably give the movie like an 8.5. It is not my favorite comedy necessarily, but I still have a ton of enjoyment every time I watch this film. So I do highly recommend it.
Yeah, and as I said, this is one of my all-time favorites. I think this movie is a masterpiece, and part of that I admit. I think it's a movie that actually it is definitely flawed, and I like those flaws. I think all of the flaws of the movie make it even more charming. Directorially, there are flaws. There are editing flaws. Like, there are bad cuts in this movie. But I just really like... It's a movie that inspires me every time I watch it because it feels so DIY and so, like, don't give a fuck. And I really, really like that about it. And it does it in such a fun and mostly lighthearted way. Like, it's goofy, it's wacky, it's ridiculous. And I think Pee Wee Herman is a funny character. I do like his comic portrayal. I think it is kind of annoying, but I don't find it grating. I think all of the worst elements about it just kind of make it sillier, and it fits really well with Burton. Burton did a great job working around it. So yeah, I give this movie a 10. This is like absolutely one of my favorites, and it's also like maybe the only comedy film I can think of that where I don't think a single joke doesn't land. I think this movie is funny from start to finish, and it's tons of fun, and I highly highly recommend it. Especially if you've never seen it, because what a trip this is if you've never even seen it. It's probably a little bit its impact's probably a little bit dulled if you watched it when you were a kid, because when you were a kid you'd be more willing to accept it and not realize how like absurd it can be. But yeah, I think all that stuff's great, and it is better than Batman Returns in my opinion, but that's just my opinion. So anyway, I think we should move on to recommendations with that said. Oh dear, are you silent?
Oh, I am here.
There you are. Okay. We had a...
Yeah.
That was a technical difficulty. Anyway, we're moving on to recommendations. So, Steven, you can go first.
I don't think of it as a technical difficulty. I think of it as a technical opportunity.
And you have managed to turn it into a hilarious moment for all of us. So that's great.
That's right. The whole world is laughing as I give you my recommendation. This recommendation is going to be an interesting one. Let's just say it's going to really test our ability to talk for 30 minutes about a singular thing, because I am going to give you the television show, a game show known as Jeopardy! Jeopardy! Is a game show that has been on the air for, let's say, quite some time and syndicated for maybe even longer, honestly. It is a very simple premise. There are 3 contestants every day on the weekdays. There is trivia. The contestants answer trivia. Sometimes they can wager money, and whoever has the most money at the end wins the day. The next day, the winner of the previous day plays against two others, and it goes on ad infinitum. So next time we will talk about Jeopardy.
Fantastic, and I like that because I really like when I can make titles and thumbnails that are really stupid and ridiculous, and I feel like we've got one coming up next episode. Stephen, I am recommending to you an album by Björk. This album is called Homogenic. This was Björk's third album. Icelandic singer, songwriter, producer, everything. Björk. And we will talk about that next time alongside Jeopardy. Yeah, so thank you everybody for watching. We really appreciate that as always. Watching, listening, whatever you were doing. Hate watching, which we've established you can't even do. So I think we did pretty well. As always, we are also on CastBox. If you are listening, watching on YouTube, the links for that always ends up in the description. You can find us on CastBox, download us, and listen to us on the go. I try to get these episodes up on CastBox as quickly as I can after we do them. And if you're listening on CastBox, check out the YouTube channel Casting 404. That is where we stream these episodes live. If you would ever like to be in the chat for that, we would love to have you. And that's all that I have to say to close us out here.
I just want to say one thing. We have discussed Sophie album in this podcast, and I just want to say from both of us our deep condolences to all of Sophie's family and friends. Obviously, there was a terrible tragedy that happened between the last two recordings of this podcast, and our condolences go out to all of you.
Oh yeah, rest in power to Sophie. Yeah.
And with that, I just, echoing thank you to all of our listeners, wherever you listen. We definitely deeply appreciate it. And we look forward to getting back together next time.
Yes, we do. And so, with that, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get wrecked. Okay, I always wait like a